One.
Welcome to the reality show. We are talking about the only topic we are talking about on the channel nowadays. The specific things we're going to talk about on today's episode are going to be humanitarian aid. Let's leave it at that broadly, and then we can get into the details when we get to that. We're going to start with the question of America, Israel's closest ally? Question mark. That's the title of the episode. We're going to be discussing that. I'm here with Morgan, Mark, Marco, and Richard. Thank you all for joining, and let's get right to it. So I want to say, because when we have titles that are maybe questionable, then I like to explain it, especially if I chose the title. Yes, America is Israel's closest ally. Let's make that clear. We might not like what they say in some cases, but if you look at, closest means closer than others. And if you look at the others, Micronesia consistently votes with Israel in the UN General Assembly. But in terms of the importance of the alliance, I think Israel's alliance with America is more important to it. Mark already thinks that Micronesia is more important, I think, from his reaction, but we'll get to him in a second, and we'll see if that's the case. America, if you look at the different reactions in different countries, America, I think the people in America support Israel much more overwhelmingly than anywhere else. The U.S. government, Biden has been talking about pretty much nothing else since this happened. He is siding with Israel. He's saying things that we don't like to hear, like protecting civilians in Gaza and so on. But he also said, if I'm not mistaken, he did say Israel should crush Hamas, right? That Hamas shouldn't exist after this. That is again, it should be obvious. It's obvious to all of us. It's not obvious to the rest of the world. It's not obvious. It's not something that Israel was saying in previous rounds. So within that context, unfortunately, the best Israel can hope for is what it's getting from Biden. I think at the moment, Mark, since you were upset with my comments about Micronesia, I'm gonna go to you first.
Yeah. Voting records aside, I do tend to think that the United States is slightly more important to Israel than Micronesia, on most days. Our greatest ally. It seems like they should be one of our greatest allies, if not our greatest ally, from the United States perspective. Like, we should choose them as an ally, because given the context they're in, they're most aligned with our American values of independence and freedom and individual rights and respect for individual rights and rule of law. And I think when I put myself in Israeli shoes, yes, the United States is our greatest ally, even if they're not the perfect, as you said, the closest rather than the perfect. It's such an interesting perspective. If Biden is serious, if he has some teeth behind the idea that Israel can, should, must, it's appropriate we support them if they do crush Hamas. If he actually has some teeth behind that, I think that's probably one of the most intense foreign policy postures that the United States has taken towards Israel in, I don't know, maybe forever. And if that is the case, then the closeness of how, who is our best ally has just jumped by an order of magnitude. Now, I'm really curious to see how consistent and persistent in the face of the blowback that we know is going to come, right? Once things start happening and the voices start saying their ridiculous things, how will he react to that? But for right now, I think we've never been a better ally than in that statement. We've done a lot of things. We've demonstrated a lot of support for Israel financially and militarily. but that's actually an exciting thought, that in the process of actually confronting the sheer ugliness of Hamas, the evil of what they've done, that we might actually put our money where our mouth is from a PR perspective, from a political perspective. And if that happens, I think that that's going to force a whole set of conversations which could be good for the world, good for Israel, good for the United States.
Yeah, yeah, and we do have to put that in that context, the historical context, and the so sort of geopolitical context of the alternatives, the other countries. Yeah, I think seeing America, like the foreign minister, secretary of state, the defense minister, the Biden himself coming to Israel, from what I've seen in a couple of days. Yeah, I would like to see them not also visiting countries like Qatar, not pretending that we should consider any other country in the Middle East an ally. But again, this is not going to happen anytime soon. It's not going to happen with a Democrat president. It's not going to happen with a Republican president. It's just not going to happen. It should, but it won't. And with the issue of protecting civilians on the Palestinian side, or minimizing civilian casualties, even there, we need to see what happens. Is it going to be a situation where, okay, Israel can say, thank you for your feedback. We'll agree to disagree on this, and then go ahead and do what's necessary. And Biden might say, that's unfortunate, and that's that. That'll be as good as we can hope for.
I will tell you, I do have one hope of what the U.S. will do that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about. I really hope that the U.S. will use their allies in the Middle East to say, you must accept Palestinian refugees. You must accept refugees from the Gaza district. You have to create the space for this to happen. If you care, you must do this. And if they could say that clearly to clarify the issue, which is, if you don't want to be part of this war, get out. And if you don't want these people to die, then allow them into your nations. They're your cause, right? If we would step up politically and pressure them and just make that case politically, if the United States did that, I think it would be a game changer.
I agree, but I don't see it happening, and I also think that it should be get out and stay out. I think the Gaza Strip should become a very different place to what it was up until now. Morgan, you're in Scotland. We've heard, luckily, Scotland has no actual official foreign policy, because if it did, we know where it would stand.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of what's been in the local news has been that the leader of the SNP, his family, are in Gaza at the moment visiting relatives. I assume his background is perhaps Palestinian, I'm not sure. But and so there's been an awful lot of sympathy voiced in that sense. So yeah, Scotland probably wouldn't, I think, be on the right side in any such, if they got involved in conflict. I'll just echo what you said, in that I was incredibly impressed by what Biden had to say. I don't say that because I particularly like Biden. It was unusually morally strong rhetoric. And that's not useless. There's something very important, I think, about morally supporting one side or another. People sometimes, the left is very good at voicing solidarity with certain causes and so on. And there's something sometimes a bit silly about that language, like solidarity is almost like a word which makes me cringe a little bit. But there is something really important, I think, about voicing moral support for the right side in a conflict. So I think that was very impressive. I think Blinken's comments have been more hedged. And so at the same time as we're getting a sort of very strong support for Israel, and a very impressively strong support for Israel, I think at the same time you're getting that support kind of undercut because of comments about, well, you need to stop the blockade, you need to stop using airstrikes and so on. And this is mostly coming from the UN and the Pope, so far as I can see, but and also very charming nations like Russia and Turkey and China. But there's a kind of undercutting that's going on at the same time. And I think that's essentially caused by moral confusion. I don't think they would see it as undermining their ally. I think they would just see it as being kind of like advocating for the moral thing to do. And I have some thoughts about why that is, which maybe we could get to later. So, but I just want to say that I think there's a kind of, the US very clearly is Israel's strongest ally, despite Micronesia, but good for them. But yeah, it's not, the support isn't as good as it could be. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, by the way, I don't want to disparage Micronesia. In the UN General Assembly, it's basically every country has a vote, and they're all equal. And you would often see, like votes being overwhelmingly against Israel. The only countries voting against the resolution against Israel would be the US, Israel, and Micronesia. So thank you, Micronesia. Marco and Richard, by the way, people who haven't been seeing the Briefly Objective in recent days, it has been way more active than ever in its history. And that is Marco and Richard doing all or almost all the work on that. And so thank you for that. I hope you've had some time to look into the topics we're talking about today. And what are your thoughts? I think you're in London, and the UK has probably been better than most countries on this.
Well, it turns out that tonight I'm the cynical bastard in the group, because I think that for a politician in the United States, not supporting Israel is tantamount to political suicide, really. Do we really expect Biden to come up on the side of anyone but Israel for the first 15 minutes, perhaps 2 weeks? Of course, the first thing he does is mobilize an airplane carrier, which it's not exactly a train. It takes days and days before it gets where it needs to get, even if it's in Cyprus or in one of the Mediterranean bases. The issue here is that despite their support, Biden, yes, sounded very good. Words for a politician are really cheap. But it sounds like, yes, go ahead, flatten them, but be nice to them. Don't be too rude. Treat them well. It's giving with one hand and taking out with the other as usual. And to be honest, it's nothing different. It's the same response we see over and over again. Here, the issue is, will Israel not care like places like Iran, Russia, and other rogue states behave, and not caring thoughts about the international community reaction? If I were them, I would do that. And Netanyahu himself is probably his political career is over, so he might well go out with a bang. Yeah,
I just want to say quickly, he didn't say flatten Gaza, although that if he had said that, I would be on this show with a Biden 2024 shirt. But he did say destroy Hamas or something to that effect, which again is highly unusual in and of itself.
I think what Biden reads out on an auto cue starts off by being strong in the beginning, and as the days and weeks go by, you see it weakening, or there to be enough selectivity in the quotes that you can pick out one which means the opposite if you choose to emphasize it. I think one of the things I saw that in the last day or so that I thought was interesting was a poll in the US of American people. Now, I'm the least fan of polls in the best of times, but even if you take a 10% variance on the result, it showed that Americans were 41% in favor of the US supporting Israel, 2% in favor of them supporting Palestine. And that leaves an awful large chunk sitting on the I don't know fence in between, or claiming some moral equivalence, or both it's a mess on both sides are guilty, whatever it is they think. Even in Israel's strongest ally, America, you've got a population that is equivocating underneath a president that is doing what he has to do now, but for how long? As for the UK, well, I'm sure in that history of UN votes, I'm sure we are frequently here in the UK in the abstain category, because that's undoubtedly the moral fortitude that we've shown in the past. And I suspect that, when push comes to shove, you may see that again. You've already seen here in the UK the leader of the opposition trotting out lines such as Hamas is not the Palestinians are not Hamas, and already you're fudging the two together. So Yes, America is the strongest ally by far, but what?
We're not talking radon steel here, we're talking rubber.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, the UK abstained on the vote on whether or not to create the state of Israel. So yes, the UK has a long history of abstaining. And yeah, that poll is shocking. I haven't seen that, but it comes back to, Marco, your point about it's political suicide not to support Israel, which I would think it certainly should be. And my sort of cynical side was, thinking Biden, has an election next year, and he wants to be on the if not clearly for him the right side of this, at least the side that is going to make it more likely for him to win that election. But yeah, it should be political suicide. But on the other hand, something you have in recent years or the past decade or two is, the fact that somebody like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib can win an election, even if it's in one local constituency. I find that terrifying, because they are not, they're not mincing words here. They are a little bit, but they are on the side of the terrorists, and they're winning elections. They're both in Congress, right? They're both in the House of Representatives. So they're winning elections every 2 years.
Well, they should get used to it, because here we got a whole opposition party who supports terrorists. So, I mean, let's not forget that the current guy who's going to be prime minister probably was elected when Corbyn was a leader. And Jeremy Corbyn was a massive anti-Semite. During his tenure, the Labour Party, was found in breach of 2 or 3 counts of breaking the law for being anti-Semitic. And this guy was in his shadow cabinet. He never really complained about Corbyn's treatment of the Labour Party turning into an anti-Semitic bunch of nutcases. It was there. It was just appeasing left, right, and centre, as like Richie said. Now he's saying things like Hamas is not the Palestinians. Like, really? I mean, in 2005-07, when a bunch of jihadi nutters were voted into a government, who do you think voted them? I wasn't. It was the Palestinians, wasn't it? And then the people go to Palestine or Gaza Strip, wherever they are, and then they complain about the fact that, oh, look, we're stuck in here. Well, what did you expect? I mean,
yeah,
just make us believe.
So just quickly, Keir Starmer is also in trouble with the, hardcore anti-Semitic faction in his own party for not being pro-Hamas enough. And yeah, I would love to hear anybody say, and I don't hear any politicians say this, including in Israel, that, well, maybe some who I would rather not be associated with, but say that Hamas is a true representative of the Palestinian people, because they are. And unfortunately, we don't hear that. Mark.
So to get back to Biden for a moment, I think that he is going to come to regret those words, because again, politics isn't. It's not like an argument where you make a point and then you stand by that point, and then you build on that point over time, and people can come back. And that's not, politics is a game of memetics and popularity in the moment. And right now he's riding this wave of pro-Israeli, or at least Israeli sympathy. And for him to actually go beyond all of the muffled, fluffy political rhetoric that he could have used, which says, we're on the side of our Israel, they're our greatest ally, it's horrible what happened. He went beyond that. And it's going to hurt him in the general election, because a large percentage of the Democrat Party is absolutely ambivalent about the issue. And to the degree, if you engage them in conversation, they'll say, well, yes, there's problems on both sides. But if you support Israel, they will fight you. And so for him to have said they could destroy Hamas, that's going to be played back. And the game in politics is not even so much winning the ideological debate for your party. the game is, or perhaps it's not the same everywhere. In the United States politics, the game is called turnout. You've got people who would vote for you if they actually went to vote. Like, okay, if they actually made it to the polls and voted, then they would vote for your side. But they just can't be bothered to make it to the polls. And so the game in American politics is not make the ideological case. The game of American politics is stimulate your base enough that they actually get off their ass and go vote. That is the thing. And for him to have said that is going to demoralize a certain percentage of the Democrat base. And those people will just go, I could go out and vote, but he was like, he said they should destroy Hamas. And I think when it comes down to it, that's going to be a major detriment to him. And that's why I actually give him, you could say, courage points on this matter, because there is an election coming up and Biden is in horrible shape for that election. And it's only going to get worse as he ages.
I thought the name of the game in federal policy, politics and election was 45 the election, like they did in 2020. And
I'm not familiar with that term, 45 the election.
Well, there was an article on the Times Magazine where they were effectively crowing about the fact that they managed to harvest ballots and effectively win the election by being so very clever. But they didn't call it cheating of the election; they called it fortifying the election. They made the process much stronger and more democratic. And I think probably Biden relies on that again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it could be also that, yeah, he's he's maybe losing some of his base, but people who are undecided could look at him as more of a viable option. Morgan, your thoughts on this?
I don't know why he's doing it, to be honest. I think it's interesting. It's hard to gauge from my point of view. I mean, I know Richard, you just mentioned that poll, but what the public feeling about Israel-Palestine is in the USA, just because I'm not there. I think Mark is probably right that it's for, actually, no, Mark, I think, did you say that it was going to demoralize the Democrat voters? You didn't say he was doing it for votes.
Well, I think right now, in the moment, his words are going to, it's like, oh, all right, he's standing up. But as the emotions of the moment go away, as people forget the images of the horrific things that have been done, as people just lose touch with the issue, more and more people are going to turn against Israel. I think this is the pattern. I put money on it. I'm absolutely horrifically counting on it. And when it comes to the election, there are going to be a group of people, the kind of people who would normally go out and vote, the kind of people who would normally be, okay, we have to be against Trump, we have to promote the progressive line, we have to do this. His most passionate base is going to have that echo. And so I think it's going to be demoralizing, not now. Now it's great. Now he's riding the political wave of the moment. But I believe that that's going to bite him in the ass when it comes to the election. That's what I was saying.
Sure. I would probably defer to that opinion. I think that's probably true. I think it's interesting looking at the responses from other countries as well, in that although this isn't the response to the government, I've been very impressed, I guess, by, do you know this news source called DW News, which is the German state broadcaster who've been very, very pro-Israel, interestingly. I'm not really sure why that is, but and then you get kind of other news sources in which are state sponsored, which are curiously critical, but like Al Jazeera perhaps. So Israel's allies aren't necessarily only the United States, and it's interesting to see who's coming out of the woodwork. I think the reason why, well, like Mark said, what you're going to get is this kind of turning of head where people start reneging on their initial support of Israel. At least my initial thought was, well, this is because of altruistic morality, and this is kind of away in objectivism can really help you understand these kind of issues, that because they feel altruistically, even though they want to support Israel, over time, as the war progresses, inevitably civilians get killed, as they have done in airstrikes so far. And because they feel altruistically, they're going to turn their support. But it occurred to me at the same time, that's presumably got to be a partial explanation, but it presumably can't be the whole explanation, because the West has been altruistic and Christian for centuries. And yet, at least in my view, this kind of concern when waging war is relatively recent. And I have some other thoughts about why that is. But I just wanted to hear from you guys. Why do you agree that it's only in recent years that the West has become kind of very altruistic in its method of waging war, and therefore they're going to change their opinion? Or do you guys think it's for something else?
I mean, certainly in 1945, the war was won. The war was fought to win, and I don't know who there was saying, after the bombing of Dresden or the dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if there were many voices saying, we're harming civilian casualties, we should have just sent soldiers to a certain death because we would have likely won anyway. But something that scares me in things that happen in the culture that maybe take time before they fully manifest themselves in politics, which is why we see Biden supporting Israel. The protests, as they're called, and celebrations, as I call them, of Hamas's atrocities, and you see people with Israeli flags being attacked. You see the rise in anti-Semitic attacks. You see organizations like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was widely supported when they were rioting in the US, and so it's a pretty mainstream organization and movement. And you see their local chapters really saying the most horrific things and making clear that they what they're advocating for is wiping Israel off the map. So I wonder if the way the West wages war now is possibly not as bad as it will in the future, if it will at all.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, I think it's not just altruism. I think it's also moral cowardice in many ways. I mean, at the moment, you're already starting to see in how things are reported, you're getting this seesaw of moral equivalence, which is listing numbers of deaths as if they're entirely identical, as if you're comparing COVID death figures from two countries without any context of who's the aggressor and what other actions were done, and the fact that the tunnels under hospitals, rockets being stored within civilian areas, all of those kind of factors don't play into it. It's just which is the bigger number, and therefore the other one is the more evil. It's as simple as that for many people who don't look any further.
Morgan, just quickly before I go to you, a good way to report number of deaths on both sides will be number of deaths Hamas caused on Israel's side and number of deaths Hamas caused on the in Gaza. Mark.
So most of the reporting I see, it's even worse than equivocating on, it's just total deaths. So there's a certain amount of deaths that have happened in this conflict, not attributing to either side, not saying, oh, there's this many Israeli deaths and this many Gazan deaths. They're not, it's just a total amount of deaths. This conflict is causing death. We want this conflict to stop, right? That is the general thinking. Morgan asked, why is this? Altruism, you could say, works on two levels. We know this. It's on the one hand, when you're faced with a moral question, you can use an altruist lens, a set of altruist criteria, to determine which is the better choice, or which is the right choice and which is the wrong choice. And if you use altruist criteria, then you're going to say, oh, well, Israel is bigger in terms of power and wealth and possibility and lifestyle and rights and pretty much everything you can think of. Therefore, they're bigger, smaller. We've got underdog altruism. We must support the underdog. That's in the moment of a particular altruist evaluation. But the real power danger of altruism is that all of the other principles that you build have altruism baked in. So it's not that in this case I'm making a choice based on an altruist morality. It's I'm making a choice based on a different morality, perhaps disliking civilian casualties. Okay, now we all dislike civilian casualties, but if you look at that from an altruist lens, it's not a sad and tragic fact that happens, especially when militaries involve themselves in civilian populations and use them as human shields against, which are war crimes. It's not just that. It's that from an altruist perspective, civilian deaths are especially evil. And so now altruism slips into that concept and it gets baked in. And then that gets baked into another one, and it gets baked into another one. And when you combine that with cognitive biases, especially recency bias and availability bias, because of social media, because of the ubiquity of reporting and information, I know more about the suffering of people in Gaza than almost any time in history anyone has known anything about the suffering of them over there. So the more that people can see suffering, and the more that the media portrays the suffering of the people in Gaza, and the more they can slant that as this is oppression, this is non-altruistic behavior, the more that you're going to get people to support Gaza, to support Palestine. Just that name. That's going to happen because that's what people have seen. Right? They've seen a lot of that, and so they have that living. There's an availability bias in their brain when they think, okay, what's the problem here? Well, I've got 100 examples of seeing suffering Palestinians. That weighs on their consciousness. And then recently, there's people dying. So we're going to forget all of the other things that we've learned, all of the other context, and we're going to do that. And that's why I think you're getting support for these people in a way that is just morally blind, in which people do not take into account, oh, they aggressed. They're sending bombs against civilians. Their intention is to kill civilians. Oh, we overlook that because of these other things. And so the human biases and the ubiquity of media is, I think that explains why they're getting such support when, one, they shouldn't, and historically they haven't.
Yes, although I would, let me say something about that in a second. I want to thank our super chatters. Hamad, thank you. Mary Aline, thank you. And Christopher said, thank you for your super chat. He says, for Gouda. I don't know what the cheese you mean. I mean, I like the cheese, but yeah. If
I believe in Gouda.
So, there was this tweet by Jeremy Corbyn that said, the unfolding events in Israel and Palestine are deeply alarming. We need an immediate ceasefire and urgent de-escalation. And we need a route out of this tragic cycle of violence. Ending the occupation is only means of achieving a just and lasting peace. This tweet was from October 7th at 1:27 p.m. UK time, so 3:27 p.m. Israel time. This was just around the time that the troops were starting to get to some of the villages that were occupied by terrorists. We already knew some of the atrocities that were being committed. And Jeremy Corbyn starts his tweet by saying both sides, and then ends it by blaming Israel. And this is unique for Jeremy Corbyn in the sense that usually he just blames Israel. And here there was a little bit, but again, this is not some, low life on Twitter. It's not somebody in a basement in Moscow. This is somebody who almost became the prime minister of this country. So yeah, going back to why America is Israel's closest ally, it's because whatever ideas were there when in the founding of America, some of them are still left, although they're being really everybody's fighting against them from all sides of the political spectrum. And yeah, I think I think we're running out of time. Speaking of running out of time, in our second topic, we were going to discuss humanitarian aid, because apparently there's a humanitarian crisis in. Actually, Morgan, I don't know. I didn't go to you. Any last comment on the America issue, and then we'll go to the humanitarian crisis.
No, not particularly. I do have some thoughts about why it is that the way Western countries wage war has become more altruistic, but I can address that in relation to this topic as well, since they're kind of connected.
All right, so I will read Mary Aline's super chat. She says context is critical. The issue of context dropping is one of the many valuable things I learned from Miss Rand. Actually, this is a good segue into the issue of humanitarian aid and humanitarian crisis. There are presumably difficulties that the people in Gaza are facing now that they didn't face 11 days ago, and the world has been urging, especially the UN has been urging Israel to allow some humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel eventually agreed, and yeah, Morgan, your thoughts on that?
Well, as it's connected to the root kind of principles that we've been talking about, that Israel is being criticized for waging a war as effectively as it can. It has its enemies surrounded, in effect, between Gaza is surrounded by Israel on all sides, aside from Egypt, and then it's the sea. So they've got them backed into a corner in a certain sense. And obviously, if Palestine is dependent on Israel for electricity and water, and they then attack Israel, they should cut this off. And unfortunately, the consequence is that people in Palestine, some of whom would be justly considered innocent, like children, for example, they're going to suffer. But that is the consequence of Palestine's own actions. As for whether a humanitarian corridor should be established, my basic answer would be probably not, in the sense that it's going to be very difficult to interpret who exactly is going to be coming out. And Israel probably doesn't want to let out people who would be its enemies. But at the same time, there are foreign nationals who seem to be caught in Gaza. Apparently there are British citizens, for example, in Palestine. And you probably want to be able to get them out. Now, whether you can actually feasibly do that or not, I don't know. But that would be one reason why you could feasibly, I think, have a humanitarian corridor for people to leave Gaza. So I'm in two minds about that. But I think essentially a lot of the humanitarian criticisms of Israel are stemming from the same kind of altruistic mindset, which is causing them to criticize the use of airstrikes, for example. So I'm a bit suspicious of the people whose primary concerns are humanitarian. So that's what I'll say on that.
Marco.
Well, would anyone argue to give Russia humanitarian aid after they've invaded Ukraine? I don't think so. Why should Israel provide any relief to the very people who caused this whole mess? Everything that comes on the head, unfortunately, I'm not saying it's pleasant at all. It's not so nice to look at, and probably it's even less pleasant being there. But whose fault is it? Why is Israel now pounding them as they should be pounded? It's their making. Everything that happens to them is their own choice, their own making. Humanely, on a personal case, one by one, it's sad, but what the heck? And the people stuck in there, why do you find yourself in this kind of situation? It's just because you go there and trying to be a do-gooder, or don't you know that the situation is what it is? And if you choose to get in a certain country like Iran or Gaza or whatever, you should be well aware of what happens. If you don't know what the situation is, well, you better stay at home.
I read earlier today that there were some UN trucks in the north of the country, fuel trucks, that disappeared. And it's pretty obvious where they went, if that's the case. And that is the problem with humanitarian aid, is that they very, in that sort of environment, it very quickly ends up in the very hands of the enemy, the real core enemy, even if you accept all of the support that many Palestinians have offered and continue to offer Hamas, even in these circumstances. But that is the problem, is that humanitarian is not a magic word which makes anybody it's bestowed upon suddenly grow angelic wings and behave perfectly as you would want them to in the first place. It's a self-deception to use that word and think no further beyond it. But that's what's going on all over the place.
I mean, we've been paying humanitarian aid to Africa for what, 50, 100 years, but where does it always end up? In the hands of the local dictators, of the local crooks. And why should it be different in a situation like this?
You can look at the state of Gaza as it is. All of the humanitarian aid that has gone into Gaza over the past few years, that has gone on tunnels, military compounds, all of the stuff underground instead of the stuff that it was purported to be for initially when it was raised across Europe and the West. The evidence is already there as to why it doesn't work, and it only leads to the opposite of your intent.
Yeah, one of the suggestions in Israel in recent days was to give humanitarian aid only in exchange for the hostages, and basically starve the people in Gaza until the hostages are released. Any aid that goes in there is going to be controlled by Hamas. That is, it's going to be controlled by the people who committed the atrocities. It goes to them, and again, we saw what happens with it. And of course, I oppose giving any humanitarian aid to our enemies, but I particularly oppose it if it is the UN that controls it, because the UN, especially the people who control the UN, is evil from the top down all the way to the bottom. But the further you get to the bottom in these, these UN humanitarian missions to different places, there you get to the real evil, and they really actually help the terrorists knowingly, willingly. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're helping. They know what Hamas is going to do. So that is where that aid goes, and I think it needs to be said and made clear when we're talking about that. It's not that somebody is starving and they're going to get food. No, they might be starving, but they're not going to get any food from this. Hamas's war effort is going to be aided here. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Thank you, Roland, for the super chat. He says, here's some humanitarian aid for the good guys. Thank you. We already got some cheese earlier, but this is Swiss cheese is also good, not just Dutch cheese. Mark, we're gonna go to you.
So to piggyback on a couple of things you said, the word humanitarian is just a magic word. It's like diversity. It just means this really great thing until you actually get into practice. And then the question is, how are people interpreting that word? What are they doing under its umbrella? And for a lot of these people, yes, we're talking humanitarian aid, but not to the people on the ground right now, to support them in the principles that are going to allow for the communist revolution that will create the kind of socialist utopia we want. And so, yes, the people will have to die, but people are going to die anyway. We can use these resources in order to educate people about revolutionary decolonization, right? So it's really critical to understand how the word humanitarian is an umbrella that people get to use however they want, and in reality. Second, you're giving resources. You can call them humanitarian resources, right? You can call them like aiding the enemy. They're just resources. You give them resources, they apply the resources. Are they going to apply them to their war effort, or are they going to apply them to their people? I don't know. What's the history? What has Hamas done historically when we've given them, oh, wow, you think so? Yeah. So, yeah. And the third thing is, from a pragmatic perspective, if we're going to give humanitarian aid, I can understand a lot of really good reasons to give humanitarian aid. If we give humanitarian aid to the surrounding countries who are going to take in the refugees, if we say, look, we're going to take an area of your country that's not being used, we're going to build resources there in order to house the refugees, in order to take care of them, in order to get them out of Gaza. If you want out of Gaza, we're going to assist that so that we can do a more vigorous war effort, so that we can handle the actual problem by addressing it directly rather than having to scoot around. From a pragmatic perspective, if we give aid to the surrounding countries to build camps in order to house refugees, in order to relocate refugees, in order to, that would be a kind of humanitarian aid that would be consistent with the underlying moral and political situation. But giving humanitarian aid to people in Gaza that's just a joke, because it's not going to go to them, or 90% of it isn't going to go to them. So,
Oregon.
Kind of drawing off, I guess, what we've been saying the whole time is that essentially this is motivated by altruism. And when I was kind of considering, well, how is it that we become more altruistic in sort of the last 100 years, in the sense, because we've been Christian in the West for centuries and centuries, and yet we wage war in an increasingly altruistic way. I came across a very interesting article about just war theory, and just war theory was something that I was taught about at school as kind of originating in the Roman Empire, but it was an interesting article, and they were saying that a lot of thinking about just war theory actually took place in the 19th century. And that's when the concept of civilian is actually invented. Before then, civilian wasn't a concept that existed. And it was used, it was invented basically for the ways that it's used now, as to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and therefore it's an unjust thing if a civilian is killed in war. And the article was interesting in that it spoke about how influential just war theorists were on the United Nations in the wake of the Second World War in writing the Geneva Convention, which is probably the most single influential document on the way we wage war nowadays. So I just wanted to mention that as why we're sort of more inclined to be like this in a situation of war, because I kind of feel like 200 years ago, would people in Western nations have had this kind of these quibbles about the enemy nation? And probably not. And perhaps that's also related to the ways in which the technology of warfare has changed, so that civilians are more in the line of fire than they have been previously. But I think there's been an essential change in our thinking, and at least according to the little bit of reading I did beforehand, just war theory is at the root of that, and at the root of just war theory is Christian thinking. So yeah, and so I think Christianity has a lot of influence on the way we think about these things, even if we don't realize it. And essentially, humanitarian aid is a very Christian kind of idea.
Yeah, and the idea that it's unjust to kill civilians in war, again, it keeps out of the equation is who is to blame for civilians, which is something we talk about here. Who is to blame for civilian deaths? Is it just the person who is actually shooting and his bullets or bombs happen to kill civilians, or is it the person who knowingly hides behind those civilians? So human shields are considered, if you use your population as human shields, it is considered a violation of it's a war crime. But is the way Hamas operates, does that fall under that category, or is it just if you take a person and you send them to knock on people's doors and so on? And
it is politically expedient not to answer that question. People have been trying not to answer that question, and hopefully this situation will clarify that to the point where the obvious truth is that if you build a bunker underneath a hospital, you're using the hospital as a human shield. It's politically expedient for the rhetoric to say no, but it's obvious what the answer is.
But that's part of the issue, isn't it? We are playing by the rules against an enemy who doesn't. How are you supposed to have even move forward from this position? Just ridiculous. It's war, for crying out loud. Nobody wants war. War, however you look at it, is destructive. That doesn't do good to anyone. But you have to wage war in this case to remove the threat, to remove the active threat. We're not even talking a possible threat. Is somebody still there infiltrating Israel, trying to kill civilians? We've seen it a week ago. We're still seeing. Why should they play nice guys?
And why should you voluntarily breach your own defenses for the benefit of your enemy to exploit? It's lunacy, but the word humanitarian covers all that up.
If there's one issue to get to the definition of what a civilian is, as a military strategist, as a political strategist, if I can attack the military and not people, I'm going to attack the military and not people. Right? There's two things. It's, one of the major mistakes you could say, and thank God he did. But one of the major mistakes Hitler made was he stopped attacking the UK air bases to start attacking cities because Berlin got bombed. And if he had just kept attacking the air bases when he was originally going after military targets, he could have really could have destroyed the UK ability to respond. But because Berlin got hit, he started hitting civilians. He started going after cities. And that's a huge military mistake. But second, from a political PR perspective, it's a mistake. And then there's just people underneath a government don't have a lot of choice about what their government does. They have some degree of choice, and that some degree of choice makes them relatively innocent. And to kill innocent people is a worse thing. And so I think it's excellent to the degree that we can avoid civilian casualties. But especially in Gaza, the people who are there, you really have to ask the question of the Winston Tunnel, right? It's like the people on the train, the people who are there, how much are they supporting Hamas? And to the degree that they have supported Hamas, then they are not civilians in that sense because they're part of the war effort. And the clean definition between if you're in the military, you're in the military, and if you're not, you're a civilian. Like that is not an appropriate use of that distinction. The distinction is,
go ahead.
Well, the distinction is, have you been in support? Have you been given your moral sanction, your political sanction, your financial sanction, your interpersonal sanction with people as you spread your ideas and as you promote certain ideas and not other ideas? Have you been supporting Hamas? To the degree that you have been supporting Hamas, you are under the umbrella of their military process because their stated goal is military. And so,
I just want to say, I think the people on the train that went into the tunnel were less guilty than the average Gaza resident. For more on that analogy,
we would think so.
Marco, you had something to add, and then actually let's go one final round, and then we'll wrap it up because we do have the briefly objective in 5 minutes, and we have a couple more super chats.
I was just saying about that definition that there are no civilians in Gaza because Hamas support is not something which is in the water. It's not a virus that you catch just by physically being there. Hamas is supported because it's based on the religions of the area. It's a religious issue. We're talking, my God versus your God here. So that's why they need to be dealt with extremely flattened.
Richard, any quick last thoughts on this or anything else you want to mention?
I'd advise people to have another look at the Cult of Moral Greyness as an essay of Ayn Rand's, the one where she stresses how people tend to fudge unwilling and unable. People claim they're unable to do things when actually they're unwilling to do things. They're unwilling to recognize what the tough choices are, and that applies to this situation thoroughly.
Morgan?
I don't have too much more to say, just that I kind of mentioned this before, but there's something really telling about who it is who's responding to this war in certain ways. The fact that Russia and China and Turkey and Iran are the countries which are calling for ceasefires and are apparently interested in civilian casualties. When are they normally concerned about that? And the fact that it's Western nations that, at least for the most part for now, which are supporting Israel, I think is a very clear moral dividing line. And I would just urge people to pay attention to which countries and which organizations call for the non-resistance to evil, which is what Hamas is, and judge them accordingly.
Yeah, let's celebrate that dividing line and strengthen it. Yeah, we need to part ways with some of the countries we've been dealing with. Mark.
Well, just the one metaphor I keep using with all the people I speak with is just imagine that the United States and Mexico are in this situation. Mexico has been bombing us and they just attacked us. What would you allow and encourage the United States to do about Mexico? And that, when you bring it home, the answer becomes clear. It's absolutely clear what would happen if we were in that situation. And to impose different rules on Israel than on us it makes absolutely no sense. It's just a sign of incomplete integration of your thinking.
Yeah, I'm glad you said Mexico and not Canada, because we do have some Canadians in the super chat in this sort of a very different way. Mary Aline, thank you for the super chat. Doesn't Hamas want war? We don't have time to go to everybody, so I'm going to answer that. Yes, they do, and they want civilian casualties on both sides. So that's all there is to that. Bonnie has been a member for 17 months. Thanks, Bonnie. I'm surprised we even had memberships for 17 months. And she says the most
OG. She's the OG.
Yeah, I believe that's it's been 17 months and not more than that. She says the most humane, the most moral action is to flatten the district that YouTube will not let me name yesterday. Yes, YouTube acts in mysterious ways, much like the imaginary friends of our enemies and unfortunately some of our allies. What is person who doesn't act in mysterious ways is Harry Binswanger, who is the person who you will hear speaking on the Briefly Objective in a few seconds. The title of that video is "There is no Arab land." So we'll see what YouTube has to say about that. But I hope everybody goes over there right now, watches that, likes it, shares it, subscribes to that channel. If you're not yet subscribed, that is the type of content that the YouTube algorithm favors. So if you think our views on this should be heard by more people, then please go ahead and do that. We'll be back here tomorrow. The Daily Objective, the reality show at the normal time. Wednesday, 90 minutes earlier for both shows. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow. Bye.